Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Geyn, and today we're discussing what happens when ancient human remains are found on your private property. That's what happened to the Reio family of Ontario. But what has unfolded for them has been a bureaucratic nightmare with crippling costs and an indefinite timeline. Christine and Dan Reio purchased a modest retirement property in southwestern Ontario for $700,000. During renovations, they discovered human remains believed to be approximately 1,000 years old. Provincial legislation required the Reios to undertake an archaeological dig, but the estimated costs are extraordinary, hundreds of thousands of dollars, with the costs increasing if more remains are found. Approximately half of the costs of both estimates they've received to date are for Indigenous consultation and supervision of the archaeological dig. The Reios sought financial assistance from the government, which can be provided if the investigation constitutes an undue financial burden. But despite these massive costs, they were denied compensation. Essentially, they were told that they could finance the cost through credit and repayment over time. To be clear, these estimates range from beginning with the low of 300,000 to upwards of $1 million if more remains are found. What happened to the Reios is wrong, unfair, and unreasonable. Their property is now unusable. It's effectively a large excavation site with tarps over it, which they cannot build on, cannot reasonably sell for residential purposes, and there's a significant risk that additional remains would trigger more extensive excavation costs. Respecting burial sites is important, but fairness requires that public responsibilities be funded by the public, not imposed entirely on innocent individuals. So the Canadian Constitution Foundation is helping the Reios fight back. This isn't just about one family. Any homeowner, farmer, cottage owner, or developer, or small business could face similar obligations if significant archaeological discoveries are found on their land. Today, we are joined by one of the homeowners, Christine Reio. Christine, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so sorry that you're dealing with us. Why don't you start by telling us about the property? What were your plans when you bought it and why did you want it?
We were looking at retirement. So we were thinking about downsizing. Our kids are out of the home, being able to have a small house that was very livable. It was a great area. It wasn't that far from Toronto, about an hour and a half out of Toronto, and we just liked the area and the property itself.
So, can you describe the moment you learned that human remains had been discovered on the property and your reaction?
Our initial reaction was, "That's interesting." We wanted to do the right thing. We believe in truth and reconciliation. We wanted to be able to do the right thing. And through a series of conversations, we realized it went from being a very simple process to being very extravagant in terms of the costs. We had a lot of sympathy. People were coming forward and saying, "I'm really sorry this is happening to you," from the police, from archaeologists, from people like that. And I turned around to the ministry and said, like, people are being very empathetic with me. What's going on? Like, how is this going to affect me? And he said there's going to be substantial costs involved with it. I did press and I found out, what are those costs? Like, what are we talking about here? And he had given the number, I believe it was around $50,000 was going to be the cost for this site investigation. We were heartbroken. We were shocked. Um,
And 50,000 is not
it's nothing to
is
sneeze
nothing
at.
compared to what it actually has
Right,
turned out to be,
right.
which is, I think the first estimate was for something like 300 or so thousand.
We've received multiple quotes. It depends on who the archaeologist is. And then every quote is pretty much doubled when you include the Indigenous engagement. So, we've received one quote for $120,000, which was just for dealing with the one set of remains. If more were found, it was going to go from there. We had one archaeologist that was running at about $35,000, $40,000 a week at a project down the street from ours. And he was saying it's going to take at least 12 weeks. And it's actually taken quite a bit longer than that, at $35,000 a week.
Wow. I
Hmm.
mean, what has the financial, or sorry, the emotional experience been like upon learning that you are on the hook for these extraordinary costs?
Every day is different. It's a roller coaster. It feels very surreal because this really can't be how this is managed. It just seems surreal that this is how the government has opted to manage this Truth and Reconciliation Initiative. Um, it's a roller coaster. We get a bill every single month for fencing because we have to have secure fencing around the property. I don't even look at it anymore. Like, my husband takes care of it because he knows for me it's very upsetting to see this ongoing expense. We have to pay for lawn care. We have a property. We have a mortgage. We have property taxes. We're paying for a property that
Yeah.
we can't use and we can't do anything with.
Yeah.
It's hanging over our head every day.
It's so emotional. We'll
Hmm.
go to break now. We'll be
Okay.
right back.
Okay.
Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where I'm speaking with Christine Reio about the discovery of Indigenous remains on her property in southwestern Ontario and the quotes for the excavation and archaeological digs, which are all six figures. Christine, the government has a policy that you can apply for financial assistance if you think that the archaeological quotes are going to pose an undue financial burden. And you very recently learned that you were not approved for government funding for this financial hardship. Why don't you tell me about what that process of applying was like and how it felt the day you got that letter?
We knew it was going to be a weird battle to go through. We had been initially told, and they gave us an example. They said, if you are worth or have $10,000 and the cost of this is going to be $9,000, we will help you out. So basically, they were okay working up to 89% of your net worth, but not 90%. 90% they'll step in and they'll help. So we knew it was going to be difficult to obtain financial assistance. We had to submit hundreds of documents. We had to submit every utility bill for the last several years, our T4s, our tax assessments, investments, bank account balances, Netflix bills, everything we had to submit to say these are our expenses. When we got the rejection earlier in May, it was very disappointing. But then as we read through it, it didn't even make any sense. The stats and the numbers in the quote in the rejection email weren't accurate. Our income had been overstated. Our expenses had been understated. The cost of the excavation, he had said, I'm basing this on the low end quote. So best case scenario, we're denying you. What happens when it's worst case scenario? And then we were suggested to get a loan and pay it off. I think the math on the letter was wrong. I think it would be about 22 to 28 years, depending on the interest rate, that we
Wow.
would be expected to pay that loan.
And you're like, this was a retirement property.
Right.
You're supposed to retire this year.
Hmm.
How has this changed those plans?
I did reach out to my boss and I undid our retirement plans. And so, I've got another 5 years maybe with them. I'm in no position to pay a loan for the next 20 years for
Yeah,
sure.
for something that you didn't
Yeah,
ever ask for.
right.
Now, you know, the process of applying for this financial assistance sounds, really arduous. What was the experience dealing with the agencies who are responsible for this? Were they quick? How did they respond when you originally reported this?
Right. We had originally applied in October of 2024. And so we just got the rejection of May of 2026. So it took that long. They had asked for additional information along the way. I think in November they wanted additional information. At that time, they said, okay, we have your complete file. But then they do come back every now and then and say, and another thing, we want some more information from you. And so it was ongoing, maybe 5 or 6 times throughout the last year and a half, we had to supply extra, tax information or extra background information for them.
I think people watching this will think, oh my goodness, this could bankrupt me if it happened to my family. The amount of uncertainty. I mean, buying a property is an emotional thing to begin with. It's supposed to be happy,
Hmm.
and it's turned into something that's really a nightmare. Uh, what would you want other Ontario property owners to know about this process or about buying property that you wish you had done differently so you weren't in this situation?
It's a hard answer because I think that um, there's no winning in this situation. We've been told many mistruths along the way. Every single government agency that should be responsible for this says it's not me, it's the other guy. It's not me, it's the other guy. And there are, to be fair, there are different ministries that have silo investments in this, but they're
Mhm.
not working together on it. I don't know if there is any good answer in terms of what happens. I mean, you could be digging a garden bed and realize that this garden bed could lead to $500,000 or $1 million um, in terms of findings.
Yeah.
There's no winning in this situation. I think everybody's at risk.
I'm so happy that we at the Canadian Constitution Foundation are able to help you. We are so concerned by what happened. I think what happened is wrong, is probably illegal. We're going to be arguing that in court. But what would you want policymakers to change about the law in, just about 20 seconds? Can you give a recommendation, top level?
Yeah, I think they need to work together. The Heritage Act says homeowner pays. BSI says, we're going to run the costs up. They just need to work together and be what's reasonable. This maybe could have been dealt with a year and a half, 2 years ago. The Indigenous community could have had their members put to rest if they were working together. I think that the government needs to reevaluate this policy overall and basically step up.
Right. Christine, thank you so much. We are going to break now. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the discovery of Indigenous remains on private residential property. The Canadian Constitution Foundation, my charity, is representing or working with a family who had a discovery like this, and the archaeological costs are all quotes in the six figures, which this family cannot afford. So the Canadian Constitution Foundation is happily stepping in to pay for counsel from Rayman Harris to represent the Reio family. And we're joined now by those lawyers, Shane, Rayman, and Leah Cummings. Shane, Leah, thank you so much for joining me today. Shane, I'll start with you. We heard already from Christine Reio, but maybe from a more legal perspective, can you explain what exactly happened here and why this case raises broader issues beyond this one family?
We've already heard there was a discovery of human remains and items of archaeological significance and cultural significance. Provincial regulations require the owner to incur this cost of removing and preserving these articles, which we understand could be in the range of at least $500,000 and could exceed $1 million. This prohibits any further meaningful use or development of the land until this is paid, and creates undue hardship for the property owner. So the broader issue is when there are costs incurred by a private owner to benefit the public interest, and they're visited disproportionately on an unlucky owner who happen to have these artifacts on their property, they are paying more than their fair share. And that might not be a just application of the law. And it may be contrary to other decisions that recognize that when there is an exceptionally high cost for public benefit, it should be paid by the public and not by the individual landowner who unfortunately has it impact their land.
I mean, now they can't do anything with this land. They can't live on it. They can't sell it. And they're obligated to pay these extraordinary six-figure costs, which some quotes exceed the value of the property. Leah, when human remains are discovered on private property, Shane alluded to this, but it triggers these legal obligations. Maybe you could expand on that a little bit, what those obligations are and why they're imposed this way.
Absolutely. Well, the first step is that the homeowner has to notify a police or a coroner, who then comes out to the property to see what's going on. From there, the registrar under the Funeral, Burial, and Cremation Services Act gets involved. They decide if an investigation needs to move forward. And this is kind of the step that these property owners are stuck in with respect to the investigation. They've been ordered to complete an investigation, and then they've gone through this process of getting these quotes, figured out how expensive it is. And there is a relief mechanism for that expense, and it's applying to the registrar essentially to establish that it would be an undue financial burden for them to have to pay for this investigation. After the investigation happens, what the next steps are is the archaeologist has to provide a report to the registrar, and the registrar decides what type of burial ground it is. So it could be, and I'm using terms in the act, Aboriginal people's burial ground, a burial ground, or an irregular burial ground. And from there, it would require the owners to enter into additional agreements with regards to essentially what needs to happen with these remains.
Mm-hmm. Shane, a really high level, this seems to engage principles of fairness. And to me, it seems like the private landowner here is being required to bear substantial costs because of something that they didn't do. The government didn't do it either. But the government seems to be getting this sort of benefit out of this creation of this cultural heritage these cultural heritage discoveries that, the homeowners don't get a benefit, but they bear all the costs. What can you tell me about the principles of fairness here?
I agree with exactly what you said, other than the fact it's not really the government's benefit, it's the benefit of everyone in Ontario.
Hmm.
The government is acting on behalf of the people to preserve our cultural heritage and fulfill other larger objectives. And the principle of fairness is it's okay for everyone to pay their fair share. Perhaps all owners have to conduct certain studies on their own property. But when an absolutely uneconomic and extraordinary burden is visited on one owner, it should not be that of the owner, but rather that's when a regulation needs to have a mechanism where the public pays for the benefit the public enjoys. And if that regulation doesn't do that and effectively sterilizes a property, it's pretty much taking away someone's property for the benefit of the public. And that should be something where compensation arises.
I completely agree. That's why we're so happy to be working with you on this case. We've got to go to break, but we'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're talking about the story of the Reio family who discovered 1,000-year-old Indigenous remains on a modest retirement property that they had bought in southwestern Ontario. They've received six-figure quotes for the excavation that could balloon to over $1 million if more remains are found. So the Canadian Constitution Foundation has stepped in to help the Reios, and we're working with law firm Rayman Harris. So, Shane, I think a lot of viewers assume that when something like this happens, when Indigenous remains are discovered, that there's a public interest in preserving, they assume that the government takes over a situation like this. But that's not what happens. So maybe you can elaborate on what actually happens under Ontario's system.
Well, the government does take over the situation. It imposes regulations and even criminal penalties if they're not respected. What they don't do is assume the cost for this benefit to everyone. And unless there's extraordinary relief provided, the property owner has to incur that cost.
And in this case, for some bizarre, nonsensical reasoning, the Reios were denied that special compensation. Shane, I'm really concerned that this situation creates a bad incentive. If people find human remains on their property, I think we all can agree that human remains should be treated with dignity and with respect. But I'm worried if, homeowners, property owners are seeing that reporting the discovery of these remains could actually financially bankrupt them. It does create an incentive to cover the remains back up or to move them, which, to be clear, is illegal. What do you think? Is the legislation as it exists right now creating a perverse incentive or a sort of moral hazard for bad behavior on property owners because they just can't bear being bankrupted by a discovery like this?
Well, I actually think the legislation recognizes important values and important considerations that help us all. And I'm not attacking the legislation, but I do have to agree with you that when you create a law that says if you provide notice of what's going on in your property, you might actually become bankrupt or lose your property because all of a sudden it's no longer economically viable. It's certainly a disincentive for a lot of people to comply with the law. And it goes to a fundamental balance in legislating anything where you want to make laws that people are able to comply with. And it goes back to laws like prohibition of alcohol, where there might be reasons to prohibit it, but if people aren't going to be morally obligated or able to comply with those laws, they really aren't good laws that are in the public interest. And although we would not recommend illegal behavior to any property owner, we could certainly understand why people would be reluctant to comply with the law if it meant losing their property on that basis.
Absolutely.
So I do think it might be like laws need to be fair and justifiable to be enforceable. And I think that is an important consideration.
Leah, if you could change this law, what What would you change?
I think we've talked about it a little bit in terms of the fact that the law is protecting important considerations, but I think in many ways it's due to the application of the law. There is this relief mechanism under the Funeral, Burial, and Cremation Services Act, this undue financial burden. And the real problem here is, what is that threshold? And can we really be saying that this is not a situation in which it's an undue financial burden? We're not saying that this should be a case of cutting corners or not engaging in these investigations. Those are important, but the question here, and Shane has said it many times, is what is that balancing act? Who needs to bear the costs of those? Is it the public who's gaining the benefit of this, or is it a private property owner who essentially is going to go bankrupt because they can't afford to do this on their property?
Mhm.
And that's, so it's more in the application, I'd say, than in the law itself that needs to be changed.
Shane, last question. How common is something like this? Do we know?
It's not very common, and I would imagine even when it does happen, most people don't have the ability to get legal counsel to help.
That's all the time we have. Thank you both so much. We've heard today about the Reio family, whose retirement property has become effectively unusable after the discovery of ancient human remains. Protecting burial sites is important, but when private property is burdened for a public purpose, should ordinary families be left to shoulder the cost alone? You be the judge. Thanks for watching, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.